Moses stood alone in the wilderness, surrounded by silence, sheep, and the burning heat of the desert. For 40 years, his life had been hidden in the backside of the wilderness. Egypt was behind him. Pharaoh was behind him. The cries of his people seemed far away. But on that day, God interrupted his silence. Moses looked ahead and saw a bush burning with fire. But the bush was not consumed. The flames rose, but the branches did not turn to ash. The fire danced, but the leaves remained alive. Moses stepped closer. Then a voice called from the fire. "Moses, Moses." He froze. "Here I am," he answered. The voice spoke again. "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you stand is holy ground." Moses trembled, because the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was speaking to him. Then God said, "I have seen the suffering of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cry. I know their sorrow, and I have come down to deliver them." For generations, Israel had groaned under slavery. Their backs had been torn by whips. Their hands had built cities for Pharaoh. Their children had been born into bondage. But heaven had not forgotten them. Then God said the words that changed history. "Go, I am sending you to Pharaoh. Bring my people out of Egypt." Moses was afraid. "How can I go to Pharaoh?" he asked. "Who am I?" And God answered, "I will be with you." That was all Moses had. No army, no palace, no sword, only a staff in his hand and the voice of God in his soul. So Moses returned to Egypt. The fugitive became the messenger. The shepherd walked back into the empire he had once fled from. With Aaron beside him, Moses entered the court of Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler on earth. Gold covered the palace. Guards stood with weapons. Priests watched in silence. Pharaoh sat on his throne like a god among men. Then Moses spoke. "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, let my people go." Pharaoh's face hardened. "Who is the Lord that I should obey him? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." With that one sentence, Pharaoh challenged the God of heaven. He thought Moses was only an old shepherd. He did not know that judgment had entered his palace. Instead of releasing Israel, Pharaoh made their suffering worse. He commanded that the people must still produce the same number of bricks, but now they would gather their own straw. The slaves cried out in pain. The taskmasters beat them.
Hope seemed to die, but God was not finished. Moses lifted his staff over the Nile, the river Egypt worshipped as the source of life, and the waters turned to blood. Fish died. The river stank. Egypt searched for water, but the Nile had become a river of judgment. Still, Pharaoh would not listen. Then frogs came up from the waters. They entered houses, bedrooms, kitchens, beds, and even the palace of Pharaoh. Egypt could not escape them. Still, Pharaoh hardened his heart. Then dust became lice. The ground itself seemed to fight against Egypt. Men and animals were covered in torment. Still, Pharaoh refused. Then swarms of flies filled the land. They invaded homes and covered the air. But in Goshen, where the Israelites lived, there were no flies. God was making a difference between Egypt and his people. Still, Pharaoh resisted.
Then disease struck the livestock of Egypt. Horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, and sheep began to die. The wealth and strength of Egypt collapsed in the fields. Still, Pharaoh would not bow. Then ashes were thrown into the air, and painful boils broke out on men and beasts. Even the magicians of Egypt could not stand before Moses because of the sores on their bodies. Still, Pharaoh's heart remained hard.
Then God sent hail from heaven. Thunder roared. Fire flashed across the sky. Ice fell with terrifying force, destroying crops, trees, animals, and everything left in the open. Egypt shook under the storm. Pharaoh cried, "I have sinned! The Lord is righteous!" But when the storm stopped, his heart hardened again. Then came locusts. They covered the land until the ground could not be seen. They devoured what the hail had left. Every green thing disappeared. Egypt became empty. Still, Pharaoh refused. Then, darkness fell. Not ordinary darkness. A thick, terrifying darkness covered Egypt for 3 days. No one moved. No one saw another person. The sun, worshipped by Egypt, could not shine. But in the homes of Israel, there was light. Still, Pharaoh would not surrender. Then God announced the final plague. At midnight, every firstborn in Egypt would die. From the firstborn of Pharaoh on the throne to the firstborn of the servant behind the mill, death would pass through the land. But God gave Israel a command.
Each family was to kill a spotless lamb and place its blood on the doorposts of their homes. When judgment passed through Egypt, the blood would be the sign. Where there was blood, death would pass over. That night, Egypt slept under a terrible silence. Then midnight came. A cry rose from the land, a cry unlike anything Egypt had ever heard. In every Egyptian house, there was death. Pharaoh's palace was not spared. The throne was touched. The gods of Egypt were silent. The king who said, "I will not let Israel go," now called for Moses in the night. "Rise," Pharaoh said. "Go, leave my people. Take your flocks, your herds, your children, and go serve the Lord." After centuries of slavery, the chains were broken. Israel gathered quickly.
There was no time for bread to rise. Families carried their belongings. Children held their parents' hands. Old men wept. Women looked back at the land of their suffering. And under the mighty hand of God, a nation of slaves walked out of Egypt. They did not leave empty-handed. The Egyptians gave them silver, gold, and clothing. The people who had been oppressed were now leaving with wealth. By day, the Lord went before them in a pillar of cloud. By night, he led them with a pillar of fire. The same God who judged Egypt was now guiding his people. But the story was not over. When Pharaoh realized Israel had truly gone, his grief turned into rage. He called his army. Chariots were prepared. Horsemen gathered. The military power of Egypt thundered across the desert. Pharaoh wanted his slaves back. Ahead of Israel was the Red Sea. Behind them was Pharaoh's army. On both sides was wilderness.
The people looked up and saw dust rising in the distance.
The chariots were coming. Fear spread through the camp. They cried out to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us here to die?" But Moses stood before the trembling nation and said, "Do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord." The sea roared before them. The army charged behind them. The people had nowhere to run. And in that impossible moment, Israel was about to discover that the God who brought them out of Egypt had not brought them this far to abandon them. And then God spoke to Moses. "Why do you cry out to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward." Forward? Before them was the sea. Behind them was an army. But God was about to prove that what blocks man can never block him. Then the Lord said, "Lift up your rod, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it." Moses stepped toward the roaring waters. The cries of the people faded behind him. The sound of Pharaoh's chariots grew louder. The earth trembled beneath the feet of Egypt's army. But Moses stood still. The same staff that had struck the Nile, the same staff that had announced judgment in Egypt, was now about to become a symbol of deliverance. Slowly, Moses lifted his hand. He stretched the rod toward the sea. And suddenly, the wind began to blow. Not an ordinary wind. A mighty wind sent by God moved across the waters. The Red Sea began to shake. The waves rose. The waters pulled apart. Before the eyes of Israel, the impossible happened. The sea opened. Two great walls of water stood on the left and on the right. The path that had never existed appeared before them. Dry ground was revealed in the middle of the sea. The God who created the waters now commanded the waters, and they obeyed.
Moses turned to the people, and Israel moved forward. Step by step, families entered the pathway through the sea. Children walked where waves once stood. Elders crossed with tears in their eyes. A nation that had walked out of slavery was now walking through a miracle. The walls of water stood beside them like towers. The darkness of fear was replaced with the light of faith. But behind them, Pharaoh was still coming. His heart was still filled with pride. He saw the open sea and commanded his army, "Follow them." The chariots of Egypt charged into the path. Horsemen raced between the walls of water. The army that once terrified nations pursued Israel into the middle of the sea. But they did not understand. The path that was opened for deliverance was not opened for destruction. Then the angel of God moved. The pillar of cloud that had gone before Israel moved behind them. It stood between Israel and Egypt. To Israel, it brought protection. To Egypt, it brought confusion. The Egyptian army struggled forward. The wheels of their chariots became difficult to move. Their strength began to fail. Fear entered the hearts of the warriors, and they cried, "Let us flee from Israel, for the Lord fights for them against Egypt." But it was too late. The last Israelite stepped out of the sea. The entire nation stood safely on the other side. The promise of God had carried them through. Then the Lord spoke to Moses again. "Stretch out your hand over the sea." Moses turned around. Before him was the sea that had opened. Inside it was Pharaoh's army, still trapped between the mighty walls of water. The king who refused to bow, the army that refused to stop, now stood before the power of the living God. Moses raised his staff one final time. The wind stopped. The waters trembled. Then the walls of the sea began to fall. The mighty waves that had stood like mountains came crashing down. The Red Sea returned with unstoppable force. The chariots disappeared. The horsemen disappeared. The power of Egypt was buried beneath the waters. The empire that enslaved Israel for generations could no longer follow them. Silence covered the shore. Then, slowly, Israel realized what had happened.
They were free, truly free. The chains of Egypt were broken forever. The people looked at Moses. They looked at the sea, and they knew that the Lord had delivered them. Then praise rose from the people. Miriam took a tambourine in her hand, and the women followed her with dancing. The sound of celebration filled the wilderness. A nation that once cried under Pharaoh's whip now sang beside the sea. They declared, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously." The God who heard their cries, the God who broke Pharaoh's pride, the God who opened the sea, had brought his people from slavery into freedom. The Exodus was not just an escape. It was a declaration to every generation. No chain is too strong. No enemy is too powerful. No sea is too impossible. When God decides to deliver his people,